Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 13 of the Forge of Freedom. Before we get into the topic for today, I just want to tell you a little bit about the podcast. I'm an attorney, a firearms instructor, and a husband with a passion for freedom. At the Forge of Freedom, we believe that freedom is the highest political goal, and we believe that individuals thrive where freedom and personal responsibility coexist. Without a populace that shares a passion for freedom and personal responsibility, the world can quickly devolve into tyranny. And it is our hope that this podcast can help motivate our listeners and those around them to create and preserve freedom for themselves and for future generations. But the task of creating and preserving freedom is not an easy one. Freedom is not given to us by government, and it is not passed on in the bloodstream. Freedom is forged through personal responsibility and continued vigilance. And we want to motivate you and equip you with the knowledge, the skills, and the attitude to develop your body, mind, and soul for the task of living a freer life and creating a freer world. We want you to have the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. We want you to be the forge of freedom. With that said, once again, I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 13 of The Forge of Freedom. Today, I'm joined by a special guest and a good friend of mine, Aaron Spurling. Aaron, thanks for joining the show. How are you today?
Thank you for having me. I'm very well. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's been an interesting day at work, and this is actually a bit of relief. It's something I'm interested in, and I always enjoy talking to you. So I hope our listeners do as well.
I hope so.
So our listeners already know a little bit about me. So let's talk about you for a little bit before we jump into the topic for today and start talking about Stoicism. You and I met through my father, Mike Ooley, and we've known each other since I was just a couple feet tall, maybe.
Yeah.
I've always thought of you as a mentor of sorts, and I've even reached out to you for life advice on occasion. I don't know if you recall, probably, especially when I was considering going to law school, I reached out to you for advice.
Yeah, unfortunately, I failed to talk you out of that, but still,
you did your best. You did your best.
I did my best. Yeah.
So anyway, I'm glad to have you on, and you're a big reason why this show exists. Just a little anecdote, I guess. I don't remember how old I was. I think I was in junior high, and you gave my father a book, A Free Market Odyssey, and I read that.
Yes.
I don't think I was even in junior high yet, but that sort of instilled in me sort of this curiosity and sort of desire to learn more about freedom, because so much of what we hear in the news is the opposite of that. And it's counterintuitive sometimes.
Very true.
But I think that you and my father are mostly responsible for instilling in me a passion for freedom. So anyway, enough of me talking. Let's hear from you a little bit. If you don't mind, tell the listeners a little bit about you. Who is Aaron Spurling?
I am lots of things, actually. Some of which I can talk about, some of which I probably can't. But I started out my quasi-adult life with the intention of becoming a philosopher. My original career ambition was to become a university professor of philosophy. I discovered and fell in love with philosophy when I was in my late teens, and I later had an opportunity, unexpectedly, to go to college, and I majored in philosophy, and actually graduated with both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in philosophy at the same time. And after that, I entered a PhD program in philosophy at the University of California at Irvine, with the intention of going on and becoming a professor. I was in that program for 3 or 4 years. I don't remember exactly how long. It's been a long time ago. And completed all the coursework for the degree and was gearing up to start working on the dissertation when, for various complicated reasons, I took a different direction in my life and ended up not completing the PhD. And instead, I went to law school, became a lawyer, and practiced law for I don't know how many years, and that's how I met your father. And throughout it all, I've done other things as well. I have lots of other interests, as you well know. I'm interested in cooking. I'm interested in science and mathematics and all these different kinds of things. Yet throughout it all, philosophy has remained my first and greatest love. And you've probably heard me make the comment before that to this day, I still think of myself primarily as a philosopher. I've just done other things to make a living. That's all. But that's who I am. I'm a philosopher to my core. At least I try to be.
Well, I think you are in a boat with many others who have studied philosophy, in terms of
Yeah.
having to find another way to make a living. I can relate.
Yes, exactly.
I can
Yes,
relate to
exactly.
that.
I often joke that when I left the PhD program, I was faced with the problem: what do you do to make a living when all you've got is a master's degree in philosophy? And the answer is you go to law school. So that was how that happened.
For me, it was either go to law school or learn a trade, and it was actually a
Ah,
close
yeah,
call for
yeah,
me. And I'm not sure if I would make the same decision again or not, but
yeah.
I
The
think
road less traveled.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah,
So, I think you said you developed an interest in philosophy in sort of early adulthood. What drew you to
yeah. My
philosophy?
teen years. What drew me to philosophy? That's a good question. Well, what happened was I was spending a lot of time in the public library during that time of my life, and just basically systematically reading my way through the public library. I had dropped out of school at the age of 15. That's I to this day have a very low opinion of the public school system. That is perhaps a topic we can discuss in a future episode. But suffice it to say, after leaving school, I love learning, but I loathe the public school system. Uh, so after escaping from the school system, I still wanted to pursue learning because I love it. I love knowing things and understanding things. So I was reading my way through the public library, just allowing my mind to develop in its own idiosyncratic ways. And I happened to come across a book on philosophy. And I was intrigued by that because I had somehow gotten the idea that philosophy was a dead letter. It was no longer practiced in the modern world. It was something that the ancient Greeks did before science was invented, and nobody actually did philosophy anymore. That was the idea I had. And so I was intrigued at seeing this book on philosophy on the shelf. So I took it off and started thumbing through it. And I realized right away that my initial thought had been incorrect. Philosophy is indeed alive and well in the modern world. And I became fascinated by it and began reading more and more in it. And as I continued to read in philosophy, I became aware that every field of endeavor has its own distinctive style of thinking. Like a physicist thinks differently from an artist. An artist thinks differently from, say, a psychologist, and they all think differently from a lawyer. There are distinctive styles of thinking to each occupation, each field of endeavor, and there is also a distinctive style of philosophical thinking, probably more than one actually. But in the English-speaking world, the distinctive style of philosophical thinking is called analytical philosophy or analytic philosophy, and it's a very distinctive sort of approach. And I read a lot of analytic philosophy, and I came to realize that the kinds of moves, intellectual moves that one makes in analytic philosophy, so perfectly matched the way my own mind naturally worked that I realized very quickly that this was what I was made to do. This was my calling in life, and I just fell absolutely in love with it. And so, when I later unexpectedly had the opportunity to go to university, that's what I went directly for. There was just no question at all. I was going to major in philosophy. If I didn't do that, my life would not be worth living. So that's what I did. That's what drew me to it.
And if I recall correctly, and I apologize if I'm getting this wrong, you had the opportunity to
That's
go
fine.
to university because of your grandmother. Is that right?
No, actually, you may be confusing me with somebody else.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
what- yeah, I can tell you
I
what
don't.
happened
I don't recall. I
if you want to
remember
hear.
it was some sort of uh, luck that allowed you to go to
Oh yeah.
university. Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, what happened was it was a strange confluence of circumstances. One day I was again browsing through the public library and I found a flyer They often have little brochures and things on racks in the public library. And I saw one for the Indiana University School of External Studies, or whatever they call it. It's basically a catalog of correspondence courses that Indiana University had available. And I looked through it and I thought, man, this sounds like a lot of fun. Some of these courses sounded really, really interesting. I'd love to take them. But I didn't have any money to take any of these things. But I had heard about this thing called financial aid. I thought maybe I could get some financial aid to take one of these correspondence courses. So I called them up. I actually proactively called them up and asked them about this. And the person I talked with on the phone said, well, we don't give financial aid to people who are not regular students, and we don't give financial aid for taking correspondence courses anyway. But he said, why don't you just enroll as a regular student? And I said, well, I can't really do that. All I have is a GED, a high school equivalency diploma. I didn't actually graduate from high school. And he said, that's fine. We take that. So I thought, oh, okay. So I didn't have anything else going on in my life. So I applied to the university, and to my astonishment, they accepted me. But I faced a whole series of obstacles because I don't know what the process is at all these days. It's been so many years, they have changed it. But in those days, there was a whole series of things you had to file and applications to submit, and not just for admission to the university itself, but also for housing and for all kinds of things. And every one of them had a fee associated with it. And we were so poor that we had no money and no way of paying any of these things. And so every time I would get one of these bills saying I need to pay, $25 or something, I would think, okay, that's it. It's all over now. There's no way I can get that. It might as well be $1 million. And yet every single time that happened, I would suddenly, somehow, somewhere get the money. It would appear almost like out of nowhere. Like, for example, you said my grandmother would send me a check for $25 just because she was thinking of me and wanted to send me some money. That's probably where you got that story.
Yeah.
And this just kept happening over and over and over again, with every single obstacle first presenting itself and then the solution just appearing out of nowhere, and became really kind of spooky. Uh, because I wasn't planning this. Nobody was organizing this. It was just sort of happening. And I've often said it was like the universe itself was conspiring to get me into college. It was just weird. So that's how I ended up going, and it changed my whole life.
Well, and maybe we'll talk about the role of fate or destiny here in a little bit. But
Maybe,
maybe
maybe,
maybe there's something to that with
maybe.
your college endeavors.
Yeah.
Um, well, I can certainly attest to that you have a love for learning and
Oh, yeah.
philosophy. I guess if you philo
Yeah.
means love and
Yes.
soft. So, are you correct me if I don't get this exactly
No,
correct,
you're
but
right.
uh,
Yeah.
sophistry means knowledge, or the love of not philosophy means the love of knowledge.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and
That's
in
how we
fact,
named our dog.
Sophie. Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, we have a dog named Sophie, and we when we were planning on getting a dog, we decided that if it was a boy, we would call it Philo, and if it was a girl, we'd call it Sophie, because if you put them together, it's Philo, Sophie, and philosophy. So that's how she
Well,
got her name.
I didn't know that story. That's great.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, I recently attended a gala with you
Yeah.
for a chef gala,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you've exhausted the program at Ivy Tech for their culinary arts. Is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I should explain, because I'm sure this is being viewed in other places, but we're based in Indiana, and in Indiana, the statewide community college system that we have is called Ivy Tech Community College, and I happen to live about half an hour from the main uh, campus of that college is based in Indianapolis, and they happen to have a really excellent culinary arts program. And I've always been interested in culinary arts and cooking and so on. And so some years ago, I don't even remember how long it was, um, I began taking courses there in cooking. And I eventually worked my way through their entire program. I think I may have taken almost every course they had to offer. And I ended up actually getting 2 additional degrees out of their associate's degrees, one in culinary arts, one in baking and pastry arts. But yeah, I pretty much exhausted their program. And along the way, I became very active in something called the American Culinary Federation, known as the ACF. It's the nationwide professional society for professional chefs. We have a chapter here in Indianapolis, and it's a very active chapter, and I'm very involved in that. So, and yeah, we had our annual gala just recently, and you joined me as my guest, and I had a lot of fun. I hope
Oh,
you did too.
I did as well. I did as well.
And the food
It
was
was
good.
it was excellent. It was much better than I anticipated. Uh,
Yeah, hey, it beats McDonald's, you know.
exactly. So if anybody challenges the fact that Aaron is a lover of learning, I will
Mhm.
certainly do my best to refute that. But
Well, thank you.
I think your efforts and your passion for learning stand on its own merits.
No, thank you.
Um, so obviously, you had an intense interest in philosophy and analytic philosophy. Um,
Hmm.
what let's I guess go ahead and get into the topic for today's Stoic
All
philosophy.
right.
What drew
Yeah.
you to Stoic philosophy?
Well, it was largely an accident. It was, gosh, I'm trying to think how many years ago it was. Maybe 10 years ago. I could have been that long. I don't really know anymore. Um, when I discovered there was kind of this modern resurgence of interest in Stoic philosophy. I had not known that before. I had been aware of Stoicism, of course, as a student of philosophy, but it was, it was an ancient school of philosophical thought. I didn't think it was, um, it was still being studied as an historical thing, but I didn't think that it had any relevance to the modern world. But about maybe 10 years ago, I stumbled across a book written by a person. I don't remember which book it was now, actually, but he was advocating adopting Stoicism as a living philosophy in the modern world, as a guide to life. And as a student of philosophy, the idea of reviving an ancient school of thought and actually using it as a guide to life in the modern world really intrigued me. I thought that was very neat. And as time went on, this became more and more of a movement. These days, if you go on Amazon and do a search for Stoicism, you'll get tons and tons of hits. I mean, there are amazing numbers of books written about this. Um, but it this awareness of this modern revival captured my curiosity enough and caused me to read more in the history of Stoicism and its substantive doctrines. And I came to feel that there was a lot of value to it. Now, I have to say, I do not consider myself to be a pure Stoic. I don't consider myself to be a pure anything, really. I try to go my own way and find truth where I can, and try to cobble together my own worldview. But I find a lot of value in Stoicism. And there's a lot to it that I've tried to incorporate in my own life. So and it's been very useful, especially over the last few years. Last couple of years have been very hard on a lot of people, including me. And I have found that Stoicism has helped me through that. Remembering and applying in my own life principles of Stoic philosophy have been very helpful in getting me through these past few years. So that's kind of what drew me to that.
Yeah, a lot of people, I think, when they hear the word Stoic or Stoic philosophy, I think they often simply think of sort of the typical sense of the word Stoic or small s
Yeah,
Stoic, right?
yeah,
Which we generally think to mean an absence of emotion or absence of feeling
yeah,
or joy,
yeah.
but that's not really what it is, right? I mean,
That is correct.
Stoic
Yeah,
philosophy is
it's
quite different from that.
yeah, yeah. You're absolutely right. There are a number of misconceptions about Stoicism, and one of them is, as you correctly point out, the idea that a Stoic is devoid of emotions, or at least strives to be devoid of emotions and not react to things. This is a very common misconception. I even heard. I won't mention the person's name, but you know who it is, and perhaps after we finish here, I'll tell you who it was. Um, but a man for whom I have tremendous respect and admiration, a very, very intelligent, very well educated man. I once heard him give a talk on a topic, and he had occasion to mention Stoicism and explained his understanding of it, and he got it completely wrong, despite the fact he was a very, very well educated man. He took the view that Stoics are these people who strive to be emotionless. And the example he gave was that suppose a Stoic is informed that his daughter had just died. He said that the proper Stoic reaction would be just sort of shrug your shoulders and say, well, stuff happens, move on, and be just totally indifferent to that. And that's completely false. That's not the way it is at all. The Stoics certainly believed that. we have, as human beings, we have normal emotions, and it's perfectly proper and fine, even necessary, to experience those emotions fully. And then once you process them, you let go of them and move on. Um, there are many stories about the ancient Stoics who followed that practice. Marcus Aurelius, there's a famous story about him that he once broke down in tears and wept upon news that someone very dear to him had died. There's another story about a Stoic. I don't remember who it was this time. It's been a long time since I read this. Who was on a ship going someplace, and the ship ran into a storm and it was being tossed, and they were in danger of sinking. And this philosopher was afraid. He had fear, and given his body language and his facial expressions, the crew of the ship noticed this. And after that danger had passed and everything was fine, they mocked him and made fun of him because I thought you were supposed to be a Stoic. You don't, and yet you were clearly afraid. And he explained to them that you don't understand. Yes, of course I was afraid, and that's normal. It is absolutely fine and good and proper to experience the normal emotions of a human being, but you don't let them rule you. You you control your emotions with reason. And once a given danger is passed, once you've properly processed the emotions, and there's no longer any benefit to anyone for you to remain in the grip of those emotions, then you need to let them go and carry on. So it's not so much being emotionless that is the key to Stoicism, it is rather resilience. It is the ability to recover quickly from an emotional shock. That's the Stoic way. So I think that you're right. That was one misconception, very common misconception about Stoicism. So I hope we've set that right now.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions about
Yeah,
Stoicism, and I think we'll get into a few other misconceptions about
yeah.
Stoicism shortly. But I want to talk a little bit about, if it's okay with you, about the sort of the history of Stoicism. Where does it come from?
Well, it started in, I want to say, like the third century BC. There's a story about a man named Zeno from a place called Citium, and he was involved in a shipwreck, and he ended up. So he survived the shipwreck, but the story is convoluted. It doesn't really matter. The point is that he founded Stoicism around that time, and he taught his students in a place was a described as a painted porch. And I don't know ancient Greek, but apparently in ancient Greek, the phrase for painted porch includes the fragment stoa as part of that phrase, and so they became known as the Stoics. So that's how that got started. And he taught his students there, attracted a lot of attention. Other schools of thought became aware of him and his work, and his students carried on his tradition after his death, and that just sort of grew to become one of the major schools of philosophical thought in the ancient world. Later on, the tradition was passed down into the Roman world as kind of the successor of the Greek world. Their view, the Roman worldview was a bit different in some ways from the Greek worldview. The Greeks tended, by their very nature, to be very theoretically oriented, whereas the Romans tended to be much more pragmatic in their orientation toward the world. And so that also became reflected in their approach to Stoic philosophy. Um, the three most well known Stoic philosophers today are Epictetus, Marcus. Sorry, I stumbled over that phrase. Marcus Aurelius and Seneca. They were all Romans, and they all tended to have a very practical orientation toward the world. Um, After the Roman period, well, things went on. Eventually, Stoicism fell into disuse in the Western world, as all things tend to do eventually. And then we had this modern revival that I referred to. It's quite an extraordinary thing, really, when you think about it. Taking an ancient philosophy from 2,000 years ago, and in the 21st century, reviving it and trying to take it as a guide for life. It's really quite extraordinary. So there, yeah,
Well, and
that's kind of the nutshell version.
and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, but I think partly why it's had a bit of a resurgence is because of the practical application of the philosophy. I
Yeah,
mean, so many people hear philosophy and their mind just immediately shuts down, or
yeah,
they start paying attention to something else. But I think partly what's so interesting about Stoic philosophy is that it does have a practical application, and
It
maybe
does.
that,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think you're right. I think that is a very big part of why it's become popular again, um, especially over these last few years. It's kind of an interesting thing. When I first became aware of this modern resurgence, I had a little thought in the back of my mind. I thought, you know, Stoicism is the kind of philosophy that people need to help them get through difficult times. And I thought, maybe this is being rediscovered and reapplied now because there may be some kind of unconscious awareness on the part of the public mind that we're entering into difficult times and we need this. But then I thought, no, that's just being silly. So, and then time went on. Sure enough, we've had some difficult times. And I think Stoicism has been a great help to people in getting through that. And I think that is a big part of why it's become popular again. Most people tend not to be philosophically oriented in the theoretical sense of that phrase. They tend to be oriented much more toward practical things, and I think that's why people are drawn to Stoicism. And having said that, it must also be said that Stoicism was not completely devoid of a theoretical foundation. Um, Now, it is true, I think, that especially in the Roman Stoics, um, they tended to play that down. For example, Marcus Aurelius has a great phrase. I'm probably going to get the translation wrong, but he says something like, "Waste no more time debating what a good man is. Be one." That sort of encapsulates Marcus's approach to things. He had no use really for theoretical speculation. He wanted the practical guidance on how to be a good man. And yet, especially in the early Stoicism, there was a concern with theoretical matters because, and this is something that's often overlooked in Stoicism, ancient Stoicism, the Greek version. There were three, what I suppose we can call pillars of Stoicism. One was ethics, but there was also logic and also physics. Um, the Stoics believed that on an in ethical terms, you needed to live in accordance with nature. In order to do that, you needed to understand physics, and also you need to be able to have you need to have logic in order to be able to reason your way through to how you live in accordance with nature. So those three components were all very important to them. But we now have much more sophisticated theories of physics, so nobody pays any attention to the physics anymore. And we actually have more sophisticated theories of logic as well. Although Stoic logic was extremely good and about 2,000 years ahead of its time, by the way. And yet, most people are not really all that interested in logic. And so it's really the ethics that people continue to talk about. Um, and that does have a strong component to it. It's very useful. And I don't know if you were going to ask me about this or not, but let me talk about this for a second. Um, Philosophy in the ancient world was very different in certain ways than philosophy in our own modern world. Today, philosophy tends to be a highly technical, professional, academic discipline. Uh, it tends to focus on very narrow technical problems, and then it tries to be very rigorous about finding solutions to those problems, and then you publish your result in journal articles and so on. And philosophers, at least in the English speaking world, tend to try to model their practice on science, specifically physics. It's often been said that philosophers have physics envy. They try to be like scientists. Now, in the ancient world, there was a strong element of that. And yet, at the same time, alongside that, there was a very strong sense that if philosophy was to be meaningful and worthwhile, it also had to provide you with a set of tools that you can use to live a flourishing life. So there had to be this practical, useful component to philosophy for it to be meaningful. I think we've largely lost that in the modern world. Now, that's one of the things that I think is really, really nice about this modern resurgence of Stoicism. We're recapturing some of that, and I think that's good. Um, but I've lost the thread of what your original
Well, and
question
that's
was.
partly why I think so many people shut down when they hear the word philosophy is because
Yeah,
philosophy has lost meaning. It has lost
yeah,
an application to real life.
yeah.
And
I agree.
and Stoicism has that component. It has that practical
Yeah, I
application.
tell you, if you take any journal article in philosophy and then show it to a layperson, and they're going to think, why do I care about the formal properties of the logic of perception or something, something like that? So why do I care about that? It's not going to mean anything to them. It's a technical thing that has no relevance to their life. But if you read the Stoics, and there were other schools of philosophical thought that also had this practical orientation, like the Epicureans, the list went on. But if you read them, and they have specific exercises you can do, specific practices you can engage in to help you through life, that has meaning, that has relevance to people, and
Well,
that's I think a big reason for it.
I guess maybe this is a good time to talk about some of those practices.
Sure.
What are those practices that you're referring to?
Well, there are a number of them. One of them, it's kind of the linchpin of them all. Uh, the Stoics were very big on journaling. What we would now call journaling, keeping a daily journal where you can reflect upon your day, where you can think about journaling both in the morning and the evening. In the morning, you journal about the principles that you want to apply. You want to practice forbearance today, or something like that, and you try to imagine what kind of situations will come up and what you will do to practice this particular virtue that day. And then at the end of the day, you reflect back on how the day went, and whether you succeeded or failed, and what you can do in the future to do better. That kind of self-reflection and journaling is a very big component of Stoicism. Always has been. That's why Marcus Aurelius wrote his text called the Meditations. He never intended for that to be published. It was only for himself. It was his own private diary where he would engage in reflection to try to improve himself. So that kind of self-reflective journaling is a very big practice with Stoics. Also, one that I always loved is it's been sometimes called the dichotomy of control, um, and it is the idea that we should focus our attention on. Well, let me back up. The idea is that we should distinguish between things that are within our control and things that are not. And when you think about it, you find that there are not nearly as many things within your control as you thought there were. You don't have any control, for example, over what other people think of you, what they do to you, uh, things like that. The things you do have control over are how you react to those things, how you let yourself feel about them, what response you give to them. Those are the kinds of things you have within your control. And the Stoics believed that you should not spend your time, it's a waste of time to focus on things that are not within your control because you can't do anything about them. The one thing that you can control is yourself and how you respond to things. That's what you should focus on. So that's an important practice for the Stoics as well. Um, Also, though, there's another practice they have in various places. I've seen it called negative visualization. This is the idea that in any given situation, you should try to visualize the worst that can happen. Now, that sounds kind of morbid. It sounds, why would I do that? Well, the idea that they had was that, first of all, if you visualize the worst that can happen in a given situation, then you can realize, I'll get through that. Even if the worst happens, I can get through that. I can deal with that. And so it loses its terror. And it also makes you realize that if anything less than the worst happens, I can more easily get through that. So I'll be fine. So it lets you let go of a lot of fear. It increases your ability to be content in your life and to live your life with a peaceful, calm outlook. So these are some of the Stoic practices. There are others of them. A lot of the books that are written these days catalog some of these practices, and actually, I've seen some that are almost like exercise books, where every day you can do a Stoic exercise in these things and write down in your journal what results you got. Very good stuff. Very good
And
stuff.
I think this negative visualization concept. I think this is a really important point to make too. That is sort of tied in with another misconception about Stoicism, that Stoics
Mm.
are sort of fatalistic. That
Yeah, yeah,
that they're sort of negative. But
yeah.
this negative visualization is actually meant to find joy even in terrible circumstances.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, the Stoics were not people to dwell on bad things simply because they enjoyed wallowing in bad things. And it's not that they believe we're just pieces on a chessboard being moved around by the gods or something like that. Uh, the Stoics believed in leading a proactive life. They believed in a life of action. They did not, and I suppose this is another misconception we should have talked about earlier. The idea that Stoicism encourages apathy and inaction. That's completely wrong. They advocated an active life, focusing on the things that are within your control, uh, but also living an active life in order to improve yourself, to cultivate virtues, to help your fellow human beings, um, and uh, and to and we they practice this negative visualization as a way of as you say, bringing joy to their own lives, um, because they found this was a way of letting go of fears and having a more calm mind. And so that's a very important thing. It's a very useful exercise. I've used it myself with great effect,
I've
actually.
heard it also called a flickering thought. I think it was William Irvine
Hmm.
that I got this notion
Oh, okay.
from. But it's just this negative visualization. But
Yeah.
the flickering thought is just emphasizes that you're not supposed to dwell on bad
Yeah.
things, but
Yeah.
simply to think about them and to think about how it could be worse,
Yeah.
whatever
Exactly.
situation you're in, and that thought helps you to appreciate sort of
Yeah.
your status in life and to help improve it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's another fact. I had talked about how it causes the possibility of bad things to lose their terror, but you're absolutely right. Another effect of that is that it makes you grateful for the good things that you do have, and it does bring joy to your life in that way. So yeah, the Stoics were not grim people. They could be very happy, very joyful people. Actually, they were just very resilient. That was a big thing for them, resilience. So anyway, yes.
Well, and I think that your point about resilience kind of takes us back to
Mm.
some earlier points you made in our conversation about Stoics wanting to live a good life, a life of virtue. I guess I'd like to talk a little bit about what is the point of Stoic philosophy to begin with. What were they hoping to achieve with the development of this philosophy?
Well, it was very much a philosophy that emphasized the cultivation of virtue. They wanted to become virtuous people. Now, this is not to say that they were indifferent to other people. Not at all. Not at all. The early Stoics, anyway, and at least some of the Stoics, uh, emphasize the importance of engaging in political life, public life, for example, as a way of benefiting your fellow human beings. So they were not indifferent to other people, but the focus on Stoic philosophy was on the cultivation of virtue. It was what one might call a virtue ethic. That's most commonly associated with Aristotle. He also had a virtue ethic, but the idea was to live a flourishing life as a human being, and a big part of that was to cultivate virtue. And there are various lists of virtues. Different philosophers have different lists of them, but there, things like courage and resilience, generosity, kindness, things like that. And the Stoics uh, were very oriented toward cultivating those kinds of virtues in their lives and becoming virtuous people. That was really their focus, I think.
And I think you mentioned the word flourish.
Mm.
A common word that you hear in philosophy is, and correct me if I'm saying this incorrectly, eudaimonia. Um,
Eudaimonia.
eudaimonia,
Yeah.
which I think means basically living a good life, living an
Yeah.
ethical life,
Yeah.
flourishing.
Yeah.
I think sometimes people think that Stoic philosophy or some philosophy, other philosophies, sort of are pursuing happiness, but it's not really happiness in the typical sense of the word
Yeah.
happiness, like pleasure. It's
Yeah.
happiness in terms of a like an inner peace or tranquility. And am I right about that? Or
Well, well, yes and no.
okay,
There have been, and I suppose there probably still are, some schools of philosophical thought that do focus on the cultivation of pleasure for its own sake. Hedonism was an actual school of thought, and a subvariant of hedonism called the Cyrenaics. They were a hoot. Those people, they really bought into the whole thing of going for the pleasure. And so, yeah, there were some people who thought that, but translating eudaimonia as happiness is a bit of a mistranslation. And you're right, it is often translated that way, and that leads people to mistake what the goal was. I think a much better translation of that term is flourishing. It's not just sitting around drinking, having a good time, being happy in that kind of very shallow sense. That's not what it was about. For the Stoics and for most schools of thought, maybe not the Cyrenaics, but the others, happiness was more like flourishing. It was happiness, according to Aristotle, was something that was self-sufficient in the sense that if you have it, you don't want anything else, because when you're happy, what else do you need? Um, it was about being a good person, and they felt that being a virtuous person was virtually the sum total of what it is to be happy. You can't be happy unless you're virtuous, and that's what they were aiming at. It was to what is the proper life for a human being to live, um, and that could be rephrased as what kind of life. Well, what is a flourishing life for a human being? What does a human being have to do to flourish? And the cultivation of virtue is the cornerstone of that. That's really the goal.
Yeah, and in fact, it can and sometimes mean the opposite of pleasure, right? It can
Yes,
being enduring challenges or
yes.
challenging yourself and getting through challenges.
That's true, and that was another Stoic exercise. Sometimes they would deliberately seek out challenging situations in order to push themselves, to grow, to test themselves. So that was something that they would often do. In addition, the Stoics and other people as well um, may deliberately endure hardships for the sake of other people. When you're a parent, for example, a good parent knows that when you're raising a child, you have to make a lot of sacrifices for that child. You ask your parents sometime. They will tell you, yes, they made a lot of sacrifices to raise Alex Ooley to be the fine young man that he is. Uh, but it's a joy to do that, and it's a duty to do that. And that doesn't make it any less arduous. It can still be difficult, but it is a good thing to do, and good people do tend to do that. So, yes, sometimes happiness and flourishing is indeed the opposite of actual pleasure. So, you're absolutely right about that. I agree with you.
And I don't know where this phrase comes from. I know it's become popular in recent years, but the obstacle is the way. And that may be
Yeah,
something from Ryan Holiday at the Daily Stoic. I'm not sure, but I know it's become
yeah. I think
popular.
one of his early books was had that title. It sounds to me like it's a quote from something. It probably is. I don't know the source of the quote, but yeah, he used that as a title to one of his books. He also has another book, by the way. I may point out. I don't know if you've read this one or you're familiar with it, but maybe a year or two ago, he came out with a book called I think The Lives of the Stoics. Are you familiar with that one at all?
I am, but I haven't read it.
Oh, okay. It's actually a good book. I should give you a little background. Uh, he basically cribs his material from an ancient book called "The Lives of the Eminent Philosophers" by Diogenes Laertius. It's a really good book, uh, but it's the only source that we have for information about some of the people that Diogenes talks about. And Ryan, I think, took his material from that, which is not a problem. That's a perfectly fine thing to do, and it's a good book, and it gives brief biographies of a lot of the Stoics, not just Marcus or Epictetus and Seneca. Those are in there, but a lot of other people as well that are lesser known as Stoics. And it's a fascinating read, and it's just very good, and it drives home a point that I wanted to make here. We've been talking about Stoicism as if it were a single monolithic thing, and actually it was not. In fact, I suppose you could, if you want to be extreme about this, make the claim that there was no such thing as Stoicism. Rather, there were many different versions of Stoicism, and if you read Ryan's book, you become aware that all of these different Stoics had their own view of what Stoicism was and how to do it and how to practice it. And I suppose that that sort of applies to me as well, since I've said that I'm not a pure Stoic, but I have found value in their work and I've adopted some of it into my own life. I suppose you could say I've developed, or I am developing, my own peculiar version of Stoicism, and I think that's something that any of us can do, and we all perhaps should do. But anyway, so there you go.
Well, I think that goes to another point that I guess I'd like to talk about a little bit. Um, it, we've talked about Stoicism, and you say it's not this monolithic thing. It's you're sort of developing your own version of it. I guess it's sort of a guiding philosophy for your life to some degree. Um, what what would you say the importance is of just having a guiding philosophy for life in general, or would you say that that's an important thing to have?
I think it's important. I think it's virtually unavoidable. I think everybody has to have some kind of guiding philosophy of life, because if you don't, then you've got no set of principles in terms of which you can make decisions about what to do in a given situation. And yet everybody does make such decisions. And so clearly they have some kind of principles. Um, Now, I think most people derive their guiding philosophy of life by simply absorbing it from the environment as they grow up. It's what they just absorb, and without being necessarily conscious about it, and not really thinking about it explicitly. And I think that's a problem, because if you just end up believing what everybody around you believes and never really think about it explicitly, there's absolutely no guarantee that the things you believe and that guide your decision making through life are actually correct. In fact, the odds are possibly that they're not correct. And so that's one of the utilities of philosophy, and that is that you learn to self-reflect. Now, you learn to think about your thinking and about your own beliefs, and try to evaluate whether or not they're actually true or false or good or bad, useful or unuseful. And once you make those kinds of determinations, you can, if you wish, begin the process of revising your beliefs in order to develop perhaps a better guiding philosophy of life. That's a stage of intellectual development that many people never reach, but I think it's a good one to aspire to.
And I think what's important to understand is that Stoic philosophy, or philosophy in general, is doesn't provide us with answers
No,
necessarily, right? It just provides a framework
yeah,
to sort of navigate our way through life. And
yeah, I agree.
so it doesn't give us the answers, but it helps guide us through making decisions about
Yeah,
our life.
it 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 gives us a lot of possible answers. There are many, many, many different schools of philosophical thought out there. Stoicism is one of them. There's Epicureanism. There's skepticism. There's hedonism. There are all kinds of things in the ancient world, all the way up to the modern world. So I wouldn't say that philosophy doesn't give us answers. It rather gives us too many answers. And they all compete for our attention, and they all claim to be correct. But and I suppose it's important to have a kind of collection of possible answers ready at hand that you can look at and think about. But I agree with you, though, that having that stock of possible answers is not the point of philosophy. The point of philosophy, rather, is, as you say correctly, it provides you with a framework and a set of methodologies for sorting through not only those existing possible answers that have been given to us, but also coming up with one's own answers that may be totally different from any that have come before. Uh, Philosophy is much more of a process than a subject. And if that's what you're driving at, I agree with you 100% on that.
So we're actually running up
Oh,
over 49 minutes now.
oh my goodness.
Time flies
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
when you're having fun. So I guess to close out, we've talked about some resources or some books that our listeners might be interested in or might need to check out. Do you have any other resources that you'd like to point out?
Well, we've mentioned Ryan Holiday. He's got several books that are very good. He also does this thing, the Daily Stoic. It's like an online email kind of thing he sends out. I would certainly recommend reading the original texts of the Stoics. The major ones that are really well known are Marcus Aurelius, his book, The Meditations, Epictetus, his handbook and discourses, and the letters of Seneca. Those are all very accessible. Um, Most people, when they are suggested to read philosophical texts, they think, "Oh my God, do I really have to slog through that?" No, those texts are actually very, very accessible to lay people. They're not technical treatises as we would know them today. Any lay person can pick them up and read them absolutely, and find great value in. And so I would certainly encourage people to read those original texts. Beyond that, there are tons of secondary sources these days. As I mentioned before, do a search on Amazon for Stoicism, and you will have no shortage of reading material. I guarantee it.
Well, I will try to link to a lot of those resources that you mentioned
Yeah.
in the show notes. And just so our listeners know, we spent a fair amount of time talking about who is Aaron Spurling at the beginning of the show, partly because I want our listeners to know who you are, because I hope to have
Mhm.
you on as a guest again in the future, hopefully.
I
So,
would love to.
yeah, it's been great having you on. I appreciate you joining the show.
Thank you
Um,
very much.
and I guess I'll just let you have one last parting shot. Is there anything else you'd like to say, or you think that the listeners need to know about Stoicism?
It is a very old school of thought, but it is one that is nonetheless living today and has the potential for greatly improving one's life, and can be a great source of comfort and wisdom in the modern world. So I encourage everyone to check it out.
All right. Well, thank you, Aaron, again for joining the show.
Thank you.
I hope to have you on again in the not too distant future. So,
Looking forward to it.
all right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. If you like the show, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. I look forward to talking with you again next week, when we will discuss the notion of positive and negative rights. Until then, remember, you are the forge of freedom.